On Cuba, we know for a fact that Kennedy actually viewed Fidel Castro in 1960 as somebody whose revolution really represented the aspirations, broadly speaking, of the vast majority of the Cuban people. He had no doubt about that. And he believed that if the United States government had handled Castro right, that he wouldn't have turned to the Soviet Union. Of course, there's plenty of evidence to support that point of view. But very early on, he realized that politically he couldn't take that position publicly.
As soon as the Kennedys got into office, they had to worry about Cuba. The CIA had cooked up a plan to invade Cuba with a force of exiles, and the CIA was itching to use this force and overthrow Fidel Castro.
He had inherited the whole thing from the Eisenhower administration.
He had been told this plan for landing at the Bay of Pigs was going to be successful. There was no need for him to consider the necessity for use of military force by the United States. We didn't have to be directly involved. That was the premise. But President Kennedy was misled. His leading advisors, particularly his military advisors, had not given him the truth. Same thing was true for the CIA, by the way.
The basic issue in Cuba is not one between the United States and Cuba. It is between the Cubans themselves. And I intend to see that we adhere to that principle. And as I understand it, this administration's attitude is so understood and shared by the anti-Castro exiles from Cuba in this country.
The planning had been that if the invasion didn't succeed, the United States would introduce its own forces.
But the CIA never clearly communicated this rather essential fact to the president. The Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. It was a disaster from the get-go. 1,000 of them were basically driven into the sea or captured. Most importantly, there was no air cover.
His argument at the time is if the U.S. gets directly involved, if American fingerprints are too clearly on the Bay of Pigs invasion, that Khrushchev will use that as an excuse to act on Berlin.
What this Bay of Pigs quickly showed was that the dominant forces in the administration were people that Kennedy had never appointed, that he had inherited from his predecessors in the CIA and the military, and they basically were assuming that they could push Kennedy around.
John F. Kennedy clearly felt that he'd been misled, that his leading advisors had not given him the truth, and that he had to be very cautious in the future about accepting anything that they said.
The CIA was very unhappy because they had confidently assumed that the president would approve of airstrikes against Castro's forces if the brigade got in trouble on the beach.
The Bay of Pigs was a major disaster for the United States, not necessarily because we had been defeated, but because it showed the world our bald aggression against Cuba. And it gave Cuba a victory over the Goliath of the North.
Nobody likes to take a hit, especially when you're so publicly exposed. But yeah, I think he learned it, and what he learned is know whose advice to rely on.
Kennedy rallied in a number of ways. For one thing, he told the American people that it was his responsibility. He used a famous phrase that a victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. But he took responsibility for it. And interestingly, his poll rating shot up to about 90%. Americans like it when politicians take responsibility.
The failed Bay of Pigs operation had enormous influence on Kennedy's image as a foreign policymaker.
The Joint Chiefs felt that he was soft. He showed that he was soft on communism. He did not have the credentials from their point of view to be able to stand up.
There was ambivalence about JFK. He was a whippersnapper. He was green. He'd been a Lieutenant JG in World War II.
John F. Kennedy emerged from that catastrophic foreign policy failure chastened in terms of the pitfalls of the use of force, and with a degree of wisdom about listening to the advice of his top generals, his top CIA officials, and other advisors, rather than listening to his gut.